In the first week of February, when London's fog hangs low enough to sting the throat and turn every lamp into a blurred coin of light, Dr. John Watson found himself again at number 221B, Baker Street. The coal fire glowed bravely. The familiar litter of chemical bottles and newspapers lay about as of old, and yet the air carried that peculiar hush which so often preceded one of Holmes's adventures. Sherlock Holmes lounged upon the settee, long and spare, his fingers interlaced behind his head. To the casual eye, he was indolent, almost languid. Watson, who had watched him through too many crises to be deceived, noted the quick, listening alertness behind the stillness, the slight narrowing of the grey eyes, the poised attention of a hound that has caught an uncertain scent. Watson had been absent in the country upon professional matters, and had returned only the evening before. He was still enjoying the comfort of their renewed companionship when Holmes, without glancing toward him, remarked quietly, "You have been writing again?" Watson started. "Not for a fortnight." "And yet there is ink upon your right forefinger, a fresh notebook in your pocket, and that uneasy honesty which appears whenever you tell an untruth, however trivial. Besides," Holmes added, allowing himself the ghost of a smile, "you have bought new pens. No man purchases such things unless he intends to use them." Watson laughed. "You will drive me to burn my papers." "Do as you please, only record what is worth recording." It was at that moment that a sharp rap sounded below. Mrs. Hudson's step came briskly up the stairs, and she entered with an object upon a salver. "It is for you, Mr. Holmes."
A messenger brought it, sir, and would give no name. He said only that it must be delivered at once, and that you would understand. Holmes was on his feet in an instant. He took the object and held it up to the firelight. It was a telegram envelope, yet such an envelope as Watson had never seen. The paper was browned and brittle, the flap held by a seal so old that the gum had perished. Across the front, in faded ink, ran the address, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street. The hand was bold, even florid, but it trembled in places as though the writer had been hurried. Holmes's nostrils flared. "Curious," said he. "Curious indeed. Telegrams are made to live minutes, not decades. This one bore the creases of long folding, the rubbed corners of travel, and a faint smell of camphor, as if it had slept in a drawer among forgotten clothes."
Most remarkable was the stamp, an oval postmark half smudged, but with enough left to show February 3rd, 18. The remaining figures were blurred, yet the century was plain. 20 years, Watson murmured. "How can a telegram—" Holmes had already slit the envelope with his penknife. A thin strip of paper slid out, crackling as it unfolded. Watson, leaning forward, read over his shoulder, "Come at once." "Stop!" "If too late, God help us. Stop. Bring no police. Stop. Ask for the lark. Stop." There was no signature. In its place a dark smear had dragged across the final line, as though a wet finger had passed over fresh ink. For an instant Watson was aware only of the familiar thrill, the sudden sense of a door opening upon danger and discovery. Then the oddity of the thing returned upon him with full force. Holmes—
It is dated." "It is dated," Holmes interrupted, and his voice had sunk to that quiet metallic tone which meant that his mind was already at work. "But it is not late. It has been delayed." He stood motionless, the telegram held lightly between finger and thumb, his eyes fixed beyond the fogged window as though he could see, through London's grey veil, the very hour in which those words had been tapped out. When he spoke again, it was more to himself than to Watson. "A message that begs haste forbids the police, and gives a password, a missing signature, and a stain which suggests either rain or something worse. Add to it the deliberate postponement of its delivery, and you have a problem in human malice rather than in human error. Watson turned to Mrs. Hudson. Did the messenger say from where it came? He did not.
"Ah, sir," she answered, "only that it was time it reached you. And begging your pardon, he looked that pale I feared he would fall on the step." Holmes nodded once, as if this, too, belonged to the pattern. Then, with a sudden briskness, he tossed the envelope upon the table and caught up his coat. "My dear Watson," said he, and now the old keen eagerness shone through his reserve, "kindly put on your boots. We are about to visit a past that has taken an unconscionable liberty with the present." So it was that, with a telegram that had outlived its proper season lying between us like a loaded pistol, the first movement of the affair which I have called the telegram that arrived 20 years late began. Holmes's energy, once roused, admitted of no delay. Within minutes we had descended into the cold February evening, on the fog pressing close about the street lamps, so that each shone like a dim halo in a cathedral of smoke. Holmes walked rapidly, the telegram folded and refolded in his gloved hand, his long stride forcing me into a half-trot to keep pace beside him. "You have a destination in mind?" I ventured. "Several," he replied. "But first we shall eliminate the impossible. A telegram does not mislay itself for 20 years. Either it was never delivered, or it was delivered and withheld. The condition of the paper suggests storage, dry, protected, and intentional. Then the delay is deliberate? Beyond question, and therefore meaningful. We turned into the Strand, where cabs rattled past like shadowy beetles, and the pavements gleamed with damp. Holmes hailed a hansom and directed the driver toward the Central Telegraph Office in Saint and Martins-le-Grand. During the short journey he remained silent, though I observed that he examined again the faint postmark by the intermittent glow of the passing lamps. Inside the great hall of the telegraph office the air was warm and metallic, charged with the ceaseless clicking of instruments. Clerks bent over their stations, messengers hurried in and out, and the atmosphere of brisk modernity seemed at odds with the relic in Holmes's possession. He presented himself at the counter with that air of quiet authority which so often opened official doors. "I require access to the records of a telegram dispatched on the 3rd of February, some 20 years past," said he. "The message was addressed to this residence." He tapped the faded direction upon the envelope. "It bears no sender's name." The clerk, a thin man with steel-rimmed spectacles, looked at him doubtfully. "Sir, records of such age are archived. It would take time." "I shall wait," said Holmes simply. There was something in his tone which discouraged protest. After a brief consultation with the superior, we were shown to a smaller office, where a stack of leather-bound volumes was presently produced. Dust rose as the first was opened, and the scent of old paper mingled curiously with the tang of ozone from the instruments outside. Holmes seated himself and began to turn the pages with swift precision, his long finger tracing columns of cramped entries. Watson, seated opposite, watched the methodical progress and could not but admire the patience that underlay his friend's more dramatic qualities. Each page represented a day's dispatches, each line to some fragment of urgency long since resolved or forgotten. At last Holmes paused. "Here." He angled the volume toward T. The date was clear, February 3rd, 18. Among the entries, one line bore our address. The message was transcribed in abbreviated form: "Come at once. If too late, God help us. Bring no police. Ask for the lark." In the margin stood a sender's name, written in a clerk's neat hand, Reginald Harcourt, Esquire, Deepdean House, Surrey. Watson felt a stir of recognition. Harcourt? The name is familiar. It should be, Holmes replied. Reginald Harcourt was a gentleman of some means. His death, if memory serves, occurred abruptly in that same year. The clerk adjusted his spectacles. I recall an old case, sir. There was talk of an accident, a fall from a terrace. Indeed? Holmes's eyes sharpened. And the telegram, was it delivered? The clerk consulted the adjoining column. Marked as dispatched by boy 4:15 p.m. No notation of failure. Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. Yet I received nothing. Could it have been misdelivered? Watson suggested. Holmes shook his head. Possible, but improbable. More likely intercepted. Observe, the message instructs me to bring no police. It implies danger and haste. If the sender died that same year, and if I was never summoned, then someone benefited from my absence. The implication hung between us like a chill draught. Holmes closed the ledger with decision. Deepdean House, Surrey. We shall pay it a visit. It was near midnight when our train bore us from Waterloo into the country. The fog thinned as we left the city, to be replaced by a raw clarity that revealed fields glazed with frost and hedgerows etched black against the sky. Holmes spoke little during the journey, though once he asked, Watson, what strikes you most forcibly in the telegram? The urgency, I replied, and the absence of a signature. Just so, and the phrase, if too late, God help us. It suggests that events were already in motion when the message was sent. Not a threat anticipated, but a calamity unfolding. And the lark? A password, or a person, or a place within a place. Words chosen for brevity often conceal more than they reveal. We arrived at a small rural station and secured a trap to convey us the remaining miles. Deepdean House proved to be a sombre Victorian manor set back from the road, its stone facade pale beneath the moonlight. Several windows were dark. How a single lamp burned in an upper room. Holmes surveyed the grounds before we approached. The terrace from which Harcourt fell, he murmured. I should like to see it by daylight. A grey-haired butler admitted us with evident reluctance. At the mention of Holmes's name, however, his expression altered to one of startled comprehension. Mr. Holmes? After all this time? You were here 20 years ago, Holmes asked quickly. Yes, sir. I was second footman then. I recall the day well. The master was in great agitation. A telegram was sent. And did you see it delivered? The man hesitated. No, sir. But I saw Mr. Adrian Harcourt, his younger brother, take a paper from the hall table that afternoon. He said he would see to it. Holmes's gaze flickered toward me, and I felt the quiet tightening of the net. Is Mr. Adrian Harcourt in residence? He is, sir. Master of the house these many years. Holmes removed his gloves with deliberate calm. Then I believe, said he softly, that we are about to discover why a plea for help was entombed for 20 years, and what shadow from that afternoon still lingers in Deepdean House. The butler conducted us into a long, oak-panelled library, whose high windows looked out upon the moonlit sweep of the terrace. A fire burned low upon the hearth, and before it stood a tall, spare gentleman of some 45 years, whose features, though handsome, were marked by a certain rigidity about the mouth. His dark hair was streaked prematurely with grey. Mr. Adrian Harcourt, announced the servant. The gentleman inclined his head. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume? Oh, your name has lingered in this house like an echo. I had thought never to hear it spoken here again. Holmes regarded him steadily. Your brother once sought my assistance. So I have been told. Harcourt's tone was even, yet Watson detected beneath it a current of constraint. It was unnecessary. The affair was a tragic accident. We shall determine that, Holmes replied quietly. You were present the day your brother fell? I was. And you were aware that he had dispatched a telegram to me? A fractional pause preceded the answer. I learned of it later. From whom? From the staff. There was much confusion. Holmes stepped closer to the hearth, extending his hands to the warmth with an air of casual inquiry. Curiously, I never received that telegram. Harcourt's gaze did not waver. Aye, then it must have miscarried. On the contrary, said Holmes, producing the browned envelope from his pocket, it was preserved. The effect of the brittle paper upon our host was unmistakable. Though he did not start, the blood receded from his face, leaving it momentarily ashen. Preserved? He echoed. For 20 years, Holmes continued. Stored with camphor, if I mistake not. Delivered to me only yesterday by an anonymous messenger who believed, as he phrased it, that it was time. Silence fell heavily between us. The fire gave a soft collapse of embers. Harcourt recovered himself with visible effort. I cannot account for that, he said. If some servant withheld it. Your butler informs me, Holmes interrupted gently, that he saw you remove a paper from the hall table that afternoon.
Saying you would see to it? The man's eyes flickered, then hardened. I may have handled it. The house was in disorder. My brother was excitable. He imagined conspiracies. Imagined? Holmes's tone sharpened by a degree. He wrote, if too late, God help us. That is scarcely the language of mild fancy. My brother was prone to melodrama. Watson could not repress a movement of indignation, and yet he was dead within hours. Harcourt's jaw tightened. He fell from the terrace. The stone was damp. There were no witnesses. No witnesses, Holmes repeated softly. And no police, for the telegram specifically forbade them. Our host turned abruptly toward the window. The moonlight silvered the long stretch of balustrade beyond. You are dredging up a sorrow long buried, Mr. Holmes. My brother's death was examined by the coroner.
An accident was the verdict. Holmes followed his gaze. May I see the terrace? After a moment's hesitation, Harcourt rang for a lamp and led us through French doors onto the flagged stones outside. The night air was keen. Frost had edged the balustrade with a pale crust. The terrace ran the length of the house, terminating in a short flight of steps, descending to the lawn. He fell from there, Harcourt said, indicating a section midway along where the balusters were spaced somewhat wider than elsewhere. Holmes knelt at once, setting the lamp upon the stones. He examined the coping, the joints, the surface of the flags with minute attention. Watson observed that the mortar between two stones near the balustrade bore a faint but perceptible crack, as though it had once been disturbed and later repaired. You have had work done here, Holmes remarked. Repairs are constant in a house of this age. Indeed, yet this section is newer than the rest. The weathering differs. Harcourt's voice cooled. If you imply... I imply nothing as yet, I observe. Holmes rose and approached the balustrade. He leaned over, measuring the drop with his eye. A fall from here might prove fatal, he said, but only if the body were projected outward with some force. A mere slip would more likely result in a broken limb upon the lower steps. Watson felt the tension mount like the tightening of a violin string. Was your brother alone when he came out here? He asked. So far as I know. And yet, Holmes murmured, he sent for me before venturing forth. He moved along the terrace, pausing where a faint discoloration marked the stone. Though time had worn it almost invisible, a darker shade lingered in the porous surface. "Blood," Holmes said quietly. "Long since washed by rain, but not entirely erased." Harcourt's composure faltered. "After 20 years? That is fanciful." Holmes turned, his eyes bright in the lamplight. "Not fanciful, chemical. Iron leaves its testimony. Your brother did not merely fall, Mr. Harcourt. He was struck." The words seemed to reverberate against the cold stone. "You go too far," Harcourt said hoarsely. "On the contrary, I go precisely far enough. The question is not whether he fell, but why he summoned me first, and who ensured that I did not come." A gust of wind swept across the terrace, extinguishing the lamp and plunging us into darkness, save for the pale wash of the moon. In that instant, Watson heard, or fancied he heard, a sharp intake of breath not his own. Holmes's voice emerged calm and measured. "Tomorrow, in the clear light of day, we shall examine the interior of the house. For tonight, Mr. Harcourt, I suggest you reflect upon a simple truth. A message buried for 20 years has at last been delivered, and with it the past has risen to claim its due." We were shown to adjoining chambers overlooking the east lawn, and though the hour was late, I observed that Holmes made no immediate preparation for sleep. Instead, he seated himself at the small escritoire provided, drew the telegram from his pocket once more, and placed it flat beneath the lamp. His long fingers hovered over it as a pianist's might over the keys before the first note. "You perceive, Watson," he said quietly, "that we stand at the confluence of two currents, the violence of that afternoon 20 years ago, and the deliberate suppression which followed it. You are convinced, then, that Adrian Harcourt intercepted the message?" "Convinced? No, but the probabilities incline heavily in that direction. He was seen removing a paper from the hall. I did not receive it. His brother died within hours, and now, after 2 decades, some hand has exhumed the evidence." He bent closer to the telegram, examining again the blurred smear at its foot. "This stain interests me profoundly." "Blood?" I suggested. "Possibly, but its position is curious. It does not obscure the body of the message, only the space where a signature should stand." "You think it was deliberate?" Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he lifted the thin paper to the light. Observe the indentation of the stylus. The pressure increases toward the end, as if the writer were interrupted or agitated. Then the sender may have intended to sign." "Precisely, and something prevented him." The implication was grim. If Reginald Harcourt had been attacked while composing the telegram, then the plea for aid was no mere anticipation of danger, but a desperate cry from its very threshold. Holmes folded the paper with care. "Tomorrow we must reconstruct the sequence of that day. Who saw Reginald last? Who had access to this room? And above all, what did he fear?" Morning came cold and clear, the frost lying thick upon the lawn. We descended early and found Adrian Harcourt already in the breakfast room, his manner controlled, though shadowed by a sleepless pallor. "I trust you rested," he said. "Sufficiently," Holmes replied. "With your permission, I should like to examine your late brother's apartments, as they were at the time of his death." Harcourt hesitated but could hardly refuse. He led us up the broad staircase and along a corridor whose portraits regarded us with ancestral severity. At its end lay a suite of rooms long since converted into a sitting room and study, yet, as our host remarked, little altered in structure. Holmes entered the study first. It was a high-ceilinged chamber with shelves of law books and a large writing desk positioned near the window. Holmes approached this desk at once. "Your brother wrote the telegram here?" "So I believe." Holmes knelt and inspected the lower drawer. Was the telegraph form kept in this room? There was a supply in the hall for convenience? Just so.
And after writing it, he would have handed it to a servant for dispatch. Harcourt inclined his head. Holmes's gaze travelled slowly about the room. He paused before the hearth, then before a narrow side table upon which rested an old bronze paperweight shaped like a lark in flight. Watson started. "Holmes!" the word in the telegram. Holmes lifted the paperweight delicately. "Indeed, ask for the lark. It may refer not to a password spoken, but to an object signifying identity. If I had arrived, Reginald might have directed me here, to this study, and to this symbol." Harcourt's composure wavered. "It is a trifling ornament." "On the contrary," Holmes said softly, "it is the only lark I have yet seen in this house." He set it down and moved toward the window. From there, one could see the terrace clearly.
Holmes measured the distance with his eye, then examined the window latch. "Locked from within," he murmured. "If Reginald left this room to go on to the terrace, he did so by the French doors below. But if he were attacked here first—" He broke off and stooped suddenly beside the skirting board near the desk. With the tip of his penknife, he prized at a minute crevice between the wood and the floor. A small fragment of darkened matter came loose. Watson bent close. "What have you found?" "More iron," Holmes said quietly. "Old, but preserved in the crack. The stain upon the terrace was not the first." Harcourt took a step backward. "You cannot be serious." "I am always serious," Holmes replied. "Your brother was struck in this room. He bled here. But he then reached the terrace, whether in flight or pursuit remains to be determined, and there the fatal fall occurred." The air seemed to contract about us. "You build conjecture upon dust," Harcourt said, though the steadiness of his voice was gone. Holmes rose slowly. "Conjecture becomes certainty when each fragment aligns. Reginald sends for me. He is attacked before he can sign his name. The message is intercepted. He dies in a manner convenient to the sole heir." "That is an accusation." "It is an inference," Holmes corrected. "One that requires corroboration." He turned to me. "Watson, we must speak with every member of the household who served here 20 years ago, and with any who remain. There is one further question which troubles me profoundly." "And that is?" I asked. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "If Adrian Harcourt suppressed the telegram, who preserved it? And why has it emerged now?" As if in answer, a sharp knock sounded at the study door. The grey-haired butler entered, visibly agitated. "Begging your pardon, sir," he said to Harcourt, "but there is a gentleman below who insists upon seeing Mr. Holmes. He says he was once called the Lark." Holmes and I exchanged a glance, in which surprise was swiftly mastered by calculation. Adrian Harcourt's face, already pale, seemed to harden into something almost mask-like. "Show him in," Holmes said at once. Moments later, a man was ushered into the study. He was of middle height, spare to the point of gauntness, and dressed in a threadbare black coat that had seen better decades. His hair, once fair, was now iron grey. His eyes, however, were keen and restless. He carried his hat crushed between long fingers that trembled not from age alone, but from some inward agitation. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked. "I am." The stranger inclined his head. "My name is Thomas Bellamy. 20 years ago I served this house as valet to Mr. Reginald Harcourt. Among the staff I was called the Lark on account of a habit in my youth of whistling at dawn." Holmes's expression did not alter, yet I saw the quickening of his attention. "You have come at an opportune moment, Mr. Bellamy," said he. Pray be seated. We are discussing the events of the 3rd of February, 20 years past. Bellamy's gaze flickered toward Adrian Harcourt, who stood rigid by the mantel. "I thought as much," Bellamy said quietly. "When I learned that the telegram had reached you at last." Holmes leaned forward.
Why, then you were the anonymous messenger. I was. Why now? Bellamy drew a slow breath. Because I have been silent too long. Adrian Harcourt spoke sharply. This is absurd. The man was dismissed years ago for drunkenness. Bellamy's eyes flashed. Dismissed for impertinence, sir, after I dared to suggest that your brother's death was no accident. A charged stillness settled over the room. Holmes gestured for Bellamy to continue. You were present that afternoon? I was in attendance upon Mr. Reginald until shortly before 4 o'clock. He'd received a letter that morning, one that troubled him greatly. He spoke of betrayal. He said he feared for his life. Did he name the source of his fear? Holmes asked. Bellamy hesitated, then looked again at Adrian.
He said only that the danger lay closer than he had believed. Adrian's lips compressed. My brother was prone to dramatics? Bellamy ignored him. At 3:30, Mr. Reginald dismissed me and wrote a telegram. He sealed it and gave it into my hand with strict orders that it be sent at once and that no one else be informed. You were to send it personally? Holmes asked. Yes, sir. I left the study and crossed the hall, but as I reached the door, Mr. Adrian intercepted me. All eyes turned toward the master of the house. He asked what business took me out at such an hour. I told him I bore a telegram. He demanded to see it. And you showed him? Holmes's tone was neutral, yet intent. I hesitated. It was not my place, but he was the younger brother and insistent. He glanced at the address and smiled in a manner I did not like. He said he would see to its dispatch himself and bade me return to my duties. Holmes's gaze shifted to Adrian. You denied knowledge of the telegram's path? Adrian's composure frayed. I may have handled it briefly. I do not recall every trivial exchange of 20 years past. Bellamy's voice sharpened. It was no triviality to Mr. Reginald. What occurred then? Holmes asked. Within the quarter hour I heard a raised voice from the study, Mr. Reginald's. I could not distinguish the words. Then there was a crash. By the time I reached the terrace, the master lay below upon the stones. And Mr. Adrian, descending the steps as though he had been drawn by the noise. Adrian's face flushed. I came at once when I heard the fall. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Yet the blood we observed within the study suggests the blow was struck before the fall. Bellamy nodded slowly. I believed as much. There was a mark upon the carpet near the desk, a dark patch that vanished after the rug was replaced. Watson felt the tightening of the narrative threads. Why did you remain silent? Bellamy's shoulders sagged. Because I had no proof, because Mr. Adrian inherited the estate and dismissed me soon after, and because I feared that without the testimony of Mr. Holmes, no one would believe a servant's suspicion over a gentleman's word. Holmes regarded him keenly. And the telegram? I retrieved it that night, Bellamy said. It lay in the small escritoire in the hall, unsealed but unsent. I dared not deliver it then. It would have raised questions I could not answer. So I kept it, hidden among my effects. I told myself that one day I would see it reach its destination. And why now? Holmes repeated softly. Bellamy's eyes clouded. Because I am ill, sir. The doctor gives me little time. I could not carry this secret to my grave. A heavy silence followed. The pieces, long scattered, were drawing together. Holmes rose and paced slowly to the window. "Mr. Harcourt," he said without turning, "did your brother confront you that afternoon?" Adrian's voice was strained. "He accused me of mismanaging certain investments, of conspiring to deprive him of control over the estate. And were you?" The question hung stark and direct. "I sought only to protect—"
Yeah, how came the timely inheritance? Adrian's gaze darted toward Bellamy with sudden fury. "You have spun a tale upon the fantasies of a dismissed servant." Bellamy met his stare steadily. "I have told only what I saw." Holmes's voice cut cleanly through the tension. "This matter has advanced beyond private inquiry. Mr. Harcourt, you would be well advised to remain within the house. I shall send for the local constable." Adrian stiffened. "You have no authority here." Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. "Authority? Perhaps not. But I have something far more inconvenient, the truth, delivered at last, though 20 years late." Adrian Harcourt's composure, though strained, did not wholly collapse under Holmes's declaration. Instead, he drew himself upright with an effort that suggested both pride and desperation. "You speak boldly."
"Mr. Holmes," he said, "yet you possess nothing beyond conjecture and the belated scruples of a dying servant. The law cannot proceed upon such vapours." Holmes regarded him with that faint air of detachment which so often preceded a decisive stroke. "On the contrary, I possess something far more substantial, sequence." He turned to Bellamy. "You state that Mr. Reginald received a letter that morning which distressed him. What became of it?" Bellamy shook his head. "I do not know, sir. I never saw it again." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "But you are certain it existed?" "As certain as I stand here." Holmes paced once across the room, then stopped before the desk. "Mr. Harcourt, may I inquire whether your brother was in the habit of preserving correspondence?" "He kept most papers in the locked drawer," Adrian replied stiffly. "Oh, but that was long ago. The contents have been sorted." "By whom?" "By myself, of course." Holmes knelt and examined the drawer in question. It bore a small brass escutcheon and a newer lock than the surrounding wood suggested. Holmes ran a finger lightly around its edges. "This has been replaced," he observed. "The old mechanism failed," Adrian answered quickly. "After your brother's death?" "Yes." Holmes rose. "Then perhaps you will oblige me with the key." A moment's hesitation, then Adrian withdrew a ring from his pocket and selected a small key with visible reluctance. The drawer opened with a faint scrape. Within lay neatly bundled documents, title deeds, bank statements, letters tied with faded ribbon. Holmes lifted the bundles one by one, scanning their dates with rapid precision. Most were of recent years. At the back, however, to lay a packet of older correspondence, the paper yellowed. Holmes untied it and spread the letters upon the desk. His long finger paused upon one bearing the same bold, florid hand as the telegram's address. "Reginald Harcourt," he murmured. "We have his script for comparison." He placed the letter beside the telegram form which he had brought with him. Watson observed the similarity at once, the looping capitals, the pressure upon the downstrokes. "The telegram was indeed written by your brother," Holmes said. "There is no doubt." Adrian remained silent. Holmes resumed his search among the older letters. Suddenly he drew out a sheet unlike the rest, a single page, folded but untied, as though inserted later. It bore no envelope. "Curious," Holmes said softly. He opened it. The paper crackled in the quiet room. Now Watson saw his friend's expression change, subtly, yet unmistakably. Well, Adrian demanded. Holmes read aloud in measured tones. If you persist in your interference, I shall be forced to expose the transfer. You know what that would mean for us both. R.H. He lowered the page. This, Mr. Harcourt, appears to be the letter which so disturbed your brother. Adrian's face drained of colour. That proves nothing. On the contrary, Holmes replied. It proves motive. Your brother had discovered a transfer of funds, perhaps, or property, conducted without his consent. He threatened exposure. Within hours he sends for me, fearing danger. He is struck in his study, attempts to flee, or is pursued onto the terrace and falls to his death. The telegram meant to summon me is intercepted by the man whose interests were threatened. You weave an elaborate fantasy, Adrian said hoarsely. Holmes's gaze hardened. Then let us test it. Mr. Bellamy, you observed a crash before the fall? Yes, sir. Holmes moved to the hearth and lifted the bronze lark paperweight. This object bears a dent upon its base, he said quietly. A recent polish cannot wholly conceal it. It is heavy enough to serve as a weapon. Adrian took a step backward. That ornament has stood there for years. Indeed. And if struck against a skull, it would draw blood without shattering. The stain in the study, the trace upon the terrace, both consistent with such an implement. Watson felt the tightening of the noose. Holmes! Oh, could the mark in the skirting correspond to its height? Holmes measured swiftly with his eye. It could. Adrian's breath came unevenly. You cannot prove I wielded it. No, Holmes conceded calmly. But you cannot explain its dent, nor the replaced lock, nor the suppressed telegram. And now we possess the letter your brother wrote, the very threat that precipitated the confrontation. For a moment it seemed Adrian might yet rally. Then something in his expression altered, pride giving way to a bleak resignation. He would have ruined us, he said in a low voice. The investments were failing. I transferred funds temporarily, intending to restore them. He discovered the discrepancy and threatened public scandal. He would not listen. You struck him, Holmes said, not as accusation, but as statement.
I sought only to silence his tirade. Adrian's voice trembled. I did not mean... You struck him, Holmes repeated. Yes! The word burst from him. I struck him. He staggered. He ran for the terrace, shouting that he would summon the police himself. I followed. He turned upon the balustrade and slipped. I swear I did not push him. Bellamy let out a long, shuddering breath. Holmes regarded Adrian steadily. And the telegram? I found it in the hall where Bellamy had left it. I could not allow you to come. I told myself the fall had settled everything. I locked it away. And kept it these 20 years, Holmes said softly, until conscience, not yours but another's, restored it to its path. Adrian sank into a chair, the strength gone from him. Holmes turned to the butler, who had hovered near the doorway, pale and rigid.
You will send at once for the constable, he said, quietly. The matter is no longer private. As the servant hurried away, Holmes stood for a moment in thoughtful silence. It was not accident, but anger, he murmured. Not premeditated murder, perhaps, but violence born of fear. Watson looked toward the terrace beyond the window, now bright in the cold light of morning. The frost had melted where the sun touched it, yet the stones remained. A message delayed, Holmes said at last, yet not denied. The truth has its own inexorable timetable. It waits, and when the hour strikes, it is delivered. The arrival of the local constable introduced a practical gravity to what had hitherto seemed almost spectral, a crime summoned from the grave by a strip of brittle paper. Adrian Harcourt, pale yet composed in a curious, exhausted fashion. It offered no resistance, as Holmes briefly outlined the essential facts. The constable, a broad-shouldered man with an expression of earnest bewilderment, listened with increasing astonishment. "You are certain of this, sir?" he asked at last. Holmes inclined his head. "The accused has acknowledged striking his brother. The fall which followed may not have been intended, but it was the direct consequence of that violence. Moreover, the deliberate suppression of the telegram constitutes obstruction of justice." Adrian lifted his gaze. "I will give a full statement," he said dully. "I have evaded this day long enough." He was escorted from the room, and with his departure the house seemed to exhale, as though a tension long embedded in its very beams had loosened. Bellamy, who had stood silent throughout, swayed slightly where he remained. Watson stepped forward instinctively and guided him to a chair. "You have done a difficult thing," Watson said kindly. The old servant's eyes were moist. "I feared, Dr. Watson, that I had waited too long, that truth would no longer matter." Holmes, who had been gazing thoughtfully at the bronze lark upon the desk, turned. "Truth always matters," he said quietly. "Its timing may alter its effect, but never its weight." Bellamy managed a faint, wan smile. "Then I am content." Holmes approached him. "One point remains, Mr. Bellamy. Why did you preserve the telegram unsealed? If you feared suspicion, why not destroy it?" Bellamy shook his head. "Because it was my master's last act of will. I could not bring myself to burn it. I told myself that if ever the chance arose, if ever, Mr. Holmes might still be found, it should be delivered." Holmes's expression softened by a degree seldom witnessed by those outside our close companionship. "You have honored him." The formalities occupied the remainder of the morning. Statements were taken. The incriminating letter and paperweight were secured, and arrangements were made for Adrian Harcourt's transfer to the county authorities. Throughout, Holmes maintained that quiet vigilance which ensures no detail is overlooked, yet the fierce intensity which had animated him earlier had subsided into a reflective calm. When at last the constable's cart bore Adrian away down the gravel drive, we stood at the window watching its slow retreat. The winter sun cast long shadows across the lawn. "Do you believe he meant to kill?" Watson asked. Holmes folded his arms. I believe he meant to silence. In anger, men seldom calculate the precise consequence of force, yet the law must judge the result, not merely the intent." "And the fall?" Reginald, already stunned, sought escape or confrontation upon the terrace. The frost that morning would have rendered the stone treacherous. A misstep sufficed. Adrian did not push, but he created the conditions. Watson considered this. "It is a grim irony. Had the telegram reached you, the confrontation might have been averted." "Or hastened," Holmes replied. "But at least the matter would have been examined in its proper hour. Instead, fear bred concealment, and concealment prolonged the shadow." Bellamy rose with effort. "I shall take my leave, Mr. Holmes. I have burdened you with a ghost." Holmes extended his hand. "Or you have freed a house from one." After the old servant departed, Holmes requested a final tour of the terrace. The frost had melted entirely now, revealing the worn texture of the stone. He paused at the section where the balustrade widened. "Observe, Watson," he said, indicating the faint repair in the mortar. "The break suggests not mere age, but impact, likely where Reginald's shoulder struck before he went over. The angle confirms a stagger rather than a deliberate climb." Watson shivered despite the sun. It is strange to imagine the scene so clearly after so many years. Holmes's gaze was distant. Time obscures but does not erase. Physical traces endure in wood and stone. Moral traces endure in men. We returned to the house to collect our coats. The library, though unchanged in its furnishings, seemed altered in atmosphere, lighter, less oppressive. The bronze lark still perched upon the desk, its wings eternally poised in flight. Holmes lifted it once more and examined the dent at its base. "An instrument of song turned weapon," he murmured. "How apt." He replaced it precisely where it had stood. "It will serve now as reminder rather than menace." Our carriage awaited to convey us back to the station. As we descended the steps, Watson cast a final glance toward the upper windows of Deepdene House. No face watched us there. During the journey to London, Holmes was uncharacteristically silent. At length, Watson ventured, "You appear thoughtful." "I reflect upon the curious agency of delay," Holmes said. "A telegram intended to avert disaster instead became its posthumous witness. Its journey deferred for 20 years. I ensured that the truth emerged only when conscience ripened." "And had Bellamy not fallen ill?" Holmes shrugged lightly. "Then perhaps the secret would have died with him. Justice, like all human institutions, depends upon fragile instruments." Watson smiled faintly. "And upon men who notice dents in paperweights." Holmes allowed himself the ghost of amusement. "Details, my dear Watson. The world turns upon them." The train whistle sounded ahead, and the familiar sprawl of London began to gather on the horizon, its chimneys rising through a pale winter haze. Another case concluded, yet unlike so many others, this one had unfolded not in hours, but in decades. As we approached Baker Street, Holmes reached into his pocket and drew out the now-delivered telegram. He regarded it thoughtfully before placing it upon the mantel.
Better late than never," he said quietly. "Though I confess I prefer punctuality in both trains and truth." With that characteristic understatement, he turned toward the chemical apparatus awaiting his attention, as though the unraveling of a 20-year-old tragedy were but an interlude in the larger, ceaseless study of human nature. For several days after our return to Baker Street, the affair of Deepdene House seemed to settle into that quiet category of concluded cases which Holmes seldom revisited in conversation. Adrian Harcourt's formal confession, taken before the magistrate, confirmed in substance what he had admitted to us. The charge, however, was one of manslaughter rather than wilful murder, and the machinery of the law moved with measured deliberation.
Yet I had observed my friend too long to mistake silence for indifference. The telegram remained upon the mantel, weighted at one corner by a small brass retort stand. Holmes would occasionally glance at it during his chemical experiments, as though the brittle slip still withheld some final nuance. It was on the fourth morning, after our return, that a letter arrived bearing the Surrey postmark. Holmes opened it with his customary economy of motion. "From the constable at Deepdene," he said, scanning its contents. "An unexpected complication." "Indeed?" I asked. "Mr. Adrian Harcourt has withdrawn a portion of his confession." I set aside my medical journal. "Withdrawn? On what grounds?" Holmes read aloud. "The accused now asserts that while he did strike his brother in anger, he did not pursue him onto the terrace, nor was he present at the moment of the fall. He maintains that Reginald fled the study alone and that he, Adrian, remained within, overcome by shock. He contends that the fatal misstep occurred without his direct involvement." "That contradicts Bellamy's testimony," I exclaimed. "Bellamy testified only to hearing raised voices and seeing Adrian descending the steps," Holmes replied. "He did not witness the terrace itself." "Then Adrian seeks to lessen his culpability." "Precisely. By separating the blow from the fall, he attempts to reduce causation." Holmes rose and paced slowly before the hearth. It is an interesting manoeuvre, one that compels us to revisit the precise sequence upon the terrace. You're not satisfied? I am rarely satisfied when a narrative shifts under legal pressure. He halted abruptly. Watson, when we examined the terrace, what did you observe regarding the spacing of the balusters? That they were wider at the point of the fall. And the repaired mortar? Suggesting impact. Holmes nodded. But we assumed the impact resulted from Reginald's body alone. Suppose, however, that another force was involved. You think Adrian may have followed despite his denial? I think, Holmes said thoughtfully, that the physical evidence must decide. By noon we were once more upon the train to Surrey, the telegram again in Holmes's pocket, as though it were a talisman of unfinished business. The winter landscape passed in pale streaks beyond the carriage window. You suspect perjury? I asked. I suspect self-preservation, Holmes replied. A subtle distinction. At Deepdene House we were received with evident unease. The constable, summoned from the village, joined us upon the terrace. Holmes wasted no time. He positioned himself at the study door and walked the path Reginald must have taken, across the flagged stones to the weakened section of balustrade. He then turned sharply as though confronted. "Watson," he said, "stand here, facing me." I obeyed. Holmes advanced with measured stride. If struck within the study, he continued, Reginald would be disoriented. He runs outward, perhaps seeking air or escape. Adrian, in pursuit, follows. A second confrontation occurs here. He indicated the repaired mortar. Observe the height of the break relative to your shoulder. I aligned myself accordingly. The fracture corresponded precisely. Holmes's eyes flashed. If Reginald turned abruptly, Adrian might seize him. A struggle ensues. The paperweight, still in Adrian's hand, could strike again or be dropped. The constable interjected, but we found no second stain. Holmes smiled faintly, because the second blow was not struck. Instead, in grappling, Reginald's weight, forced against the balustrade, the weakened mortar yielded. The impact fractured the stone before he went over. Watson felt a chill. Then Adrian's presence at the balustrade is implicit. Indeed, the fracture's angle indicates lateral force, not a solitary stumble. A single man slipping forward would not break the mortar thus. Two bodies colliding would. The constable frowned. You are certain? Holmes knelt and traced the line of the repair. Quite. The mason who restored it filled a diagonal crack consistent with outward pressure from within. Reginald did not merely topple,
and he was driven against this point. At that moment, Adrian Harcourt himself emerged onto the terrace, escorted by a warder. His expression upon seeing Holmes was one of weary defiance. You return to embellish your theory, he said bitterly. Holmes rose. Not embellish, clarify. You struck your brother in the study. He fled. You followed. There was a struggle here. The balustrade broke under combined force. You were present at the instant of his fall. Adrian's jaw tightened. You cannot prove that. Holmes gestured to the fracture. The stone proves it. Your revised account fails to explain the direction of impact. Silence stretched between them. Taut as wire, Adrian's shoulders sagged. It was not as you imagine, he muttered. He accused me still. I seized him to restrain him. He wrenched away. I grasped at his coat. And the stone gave way? Holmes inclined his head. Then your first confession, though incomplete, was nearer the truth. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. I did not push him deliberately. I have never asserted that you did, Holmes replied. But you were there. The warder stepped forward at a sign from the constable. Adrian offered no further protest as he was led inside once more. Holmes remained upon the terrace a moment longer, gazing at the repaired mortar in reflective silence. "Law will determine the degree," he said at last, "but facts must remain unaltered." As we departed Deepdene for the second time, I sensed that the final ambiguity had been dispelled. The telegram, long delayed, had not merely accused, it had compelled precision. And in that precision lay the quiet,
inexorable justice which Holmes pursued, not with passion, but with an unwavering fidelity to detail that neither time nor revision could defeat. The legal proceedings which followed our second visit to Deepdene moved with a swiftness proportionate to the clarity of the evidence. Holmes was summoned to give testimony regarding the physical condition of the terrace and the logical reconstruction of events. I accompanied him to the county court, where the winter light filtered thinly through high windows, lending the chamber a pale severity befitting its purpose. Adrian Harcourt stood in the dock, composed yet visibly diminished. The earlier hauteur had left him. In its place was a restrained fatigue, as of a man who has struggled long against an encroaching tide, and at last ceased to resist. Bellamy, frailer still, I occupied a seat near the rear, his thin hands folded upon his cane. Holmes's evidence was delivered without flourish. He described the fracture in the mortar, the angle of impact, the correspondence between the height of the break and the average shoulder line, and the improbability of a solitary slip producing such damage. He spoke not as advocate, but as analyst, and the effect upon the jury was marked. The sequence unfolded before them as plainly as if the frost still lay upon the terrace stones. Under examination, Adrian repeated his revised account, that he had followed his brother only to prevent scandal, that he had seized him in agitation, and that the fall resulted from mutual imbalance rather than deliberate propulsion. Holmes did not contest this nuance. He confined himself to the incontrovertible fact of presence and struggle, and when at last the verdict was delivered, manslaughter, the subdued murmur within the court, bore the character less of shock than of solemn inevitability. Sentence was pronounced with consideration of the elapsed years and the absence of prior offence, yet the term imposed would remove Adrian Harcourt from Deepdene for a substantial period. As we left the court, Bellamy approached us with slow, halting steps. "It is done, then?" he said. "It is done," Holmes replied, gently. The old man's eyes glistened. "I feared I should not live to see it." "You have seen it," Holmes said, "and that suffices." Bellamy drew from his coat a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "There is one more matter," he said, offering it to Holmes. "I found this among my effects after delivering the telegram. I had forgotten it." Holmes accepted the parcel and unwrapped it carefully. Within lay a slender notebook, its leather cover worn smooth by years. "My master's," Bellamy explained. "A diary he kept sporadically. I did not read it. I thought it might be of interest." Holmes opened the volume and turned several pages. His eyes moved swiftly, then slowed. He handed the book to me, indicating a marked entry dated February 3rd, the fatal day. I read aloud. "A H grows desperate. I fear he has involved us beyond recall. If I confront him, I must have witness, have written to Holmes. Should he arrive in time, perhaps ruin may yet be averted." I closed the diary softly. The words, written in a steady hand, carried a quiet poignancy that the telegram's urgency had only hinted at. Holmes replaced the notebook in its wrapping. "Why, this confirms motive and intention beyond dispute. It will be lodged with the court records." Bellamy nodded, relief and exhaustion mingling upon his features. "Then my part is ended." Holmes clasped his hand briefly. "Your part was essential." We watched as he made his slow way down the steps, the winter sun casting his elongated shadow before him like the final trace of a long-kept secret. On the return journey to London, Holmes sat opposite me in thoughtful silence. The rhythm of the train seemed to underscore the measured resolution of the affair. "You appear reflective," I observed. "I consider the delicate interplay of chance and conscience," Holmes replied. Had Bellamy destroyed the telegram in fear, had illness not prompted confession, or had we neglected the fracture in the mortar, each contingency might have preserved a false narrative. And yet the truth emerged. Holmes inclined his head, because physical fact is stubborn. It resists alteration. Men may amend their memories, but stone and iron do not. Back at Baker Street, the familiar warmth of our rooms greeted us. Holmes placed the diary beside the telegram upon the mantel, regarding them both for a moment. "Two documents," he said, "one written in haste, the other in deliberation. Together they bridge 20 years. Watson seated himself by the fire. "Do you regret that you did not receive the message in its proper hour?" Holmes considered. "Regret is an indulgence rarely afforded to those engaged in inquiry. Yet I acknowledge a certain irony. Reginald sought prevention, as instead he obtained posthumous vindication." He lifted the telegram, its paper now more fragile than ever. "There is a lesson here, Watson." "And that is?" "That the suppression of truth requires perpetual vigilance, whereas its revelation demands only a single honest act." He placed the telegram back upon the mantel with deliberate care. In the days that followed, news reached us that Adrian Harcourt had been conveyed to serve his sentence. Deepdene House would pass into temporary stewardship, its terrace repaired not merely in mortar, but in memory. One evening, as the firelight flickered across the room, Holmes reached for his violin and drew from it a low, contemplative air. The notes rose and fell with a subdued melancholy that seemed to echo the lark's arrested flight upon that bronze paperweight miles away. Watson, observing him, felt anew that curious blend of admiration and affection which had so often accompanied his friend's triumphs, not triumphs of spectacle, but of quiet, inexorable reasoning. The telegram that had arrived 20 years late lay no longer as accusation, but as testament. And in its belated delivery it had accomplished precisely what it was first intended to do. It had summoned Sherlock Holmes. The affair might have ended there, sealed within the sober pages of the county records, had not one final development compelled us to revisit it in spirit, if not in person. It came to us in the form of a black-edged envelope delivered to Baker Street some 6 weeks after the trial. Holmes broke the seal in silence and read the brief note within. He handed it to me without comment. It was from the village doctor at Deepdene. "Mr. and Thomas Bellamy passed peacefully in his sleep 3 nights past. In his final hours he expressed gratitude that his conscience had been unburdened. He spoke your name with clarity. I thought you would wish to know." I laid the note down gently. "He did not long survive his task," I said. "No," Holmes replied quietly, "but he survived it sufficiently." For a time we sat without speech, the late afternoon light slanting pale across the carpet. The telegram and diary still rested upon the mantel, awaiting formal transfer to the proper authorities. Holmes rose at last and took up the diary, turning to its final entry once more. "It is curious, Watson," he said, "how often the smallest delay alters the architecture of fate. Reginald's message, had it reached me in its hour, might have prevented violence. Instead, its silence permitted it." "And yet," I ventured, "its eventual delivery secured justice." Holmes inclined his head. "Justice of a tempered kind. The law recognized the absence of premeditated intent. That is fitting. Rage, not calculation, guided Adrian's hand. He closed the diary and replaced it beside the telegram. But the suppression, that was calculation." "Fear often is," I observed, Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. "You grow philosophical, my dear Watson." "It is infectious." He crossed to the window and looked down upon Baker Street, where the lamps were beginning to glow in the dusk. "There is another aspect which intrigues me still." "And that is?" "The phrase in the telegrams, 'ask for the lark.' We have treated it as an instruction to identify Bellamy, yet I suspect it held a further significance." "In what sense?" Holmes returned to the hearth and regarded the fire thoughtfully. "Reginald was a man of habit. His diary suggests deliberation even under stress. To include that phrase implies anticipation, that he feared interception. You think he suspected his brother? I think he feared betrayal from within the house. By directing me to ask for the lark, he ensured that, should the telegram be opened by hostile eyes, its meaning would remain obscure." Watson considered this. "Then even in alarm," he reasoned. "Precisely. It is a small but telling tribute to his clarity of mind." The fire settled with a soft collapse, sending a brief cascade of sparks upward. Holmes watched them with abstracted attention. "Do you find satisfaction in the resolution?" I asked after a pause. Satisfaction?" he reflected. "In the intellectual sense, yes. The chain of cause and effect was restored. In the human sense, less so. 2 brothers destroyed by mistrust, a loyal servant burdened for decades, a household overshadowed by unspoken guilt. It is a bleak arithmetic." "And yet you would not refrain from such inquiries?" "Certainly not." "Bleakness does not absolve falsehood." He reached for the telegram and held it once more between finger and thumb. The paper had grown more fragile with each handling, its edges flaking faintly. "It has fulfilled its function," he said softly. Watson watched as he placed it within a small protective sleeve, then sealed it in an envelope addressed to the county clerk. "Evidence must reside where it belongs," Holmes remarked. "Memory is unreliable custodian." As he set the sealed envelope aside, a client's knock sounded below, brisk and impatient. Holmes's eyes brightened with that familiar spark of renewed engagement. "Another problem seeks attention," he said lightly. "The world, you perceive, does not pause." I rose, feeling that mingled anticipation and affection which so often accompanied the threshold of a new case. Before descending, Holmes paused once more before the mantel, now bare of the telegram and diary. "Time," he said, almost to himself, "is an ally to those who trust. In fact, it may delay, but it does not ultimately conceal." He took up his coat and hat with a swift, decisive motion, and together we went down to meet whatever perplexity awaited us below. In reflecting upon the matter of the telegram that arrived 20 years late, I am struck not by its strangeness, though that was considerable, nor by the legal intricacies which ensued, but by the steadfastness with which my friend pursued coherence where others had accepted convenience. It was never the drama of accusation that moved him, but the quiet insistence that events must align with reason. Reginald Harcourt's plea, uttered in urgency and lost in silence, at last reached the mind for which it was intended. Though the aid he sought could not save him, it secured something perhaps equally vital, the restoration of truth. And so, as Holmes resumed his customary seat by the fire that evening, violin at hand and gaze distant, I was reminded once more that his genius lay not merely in deduction, but in fidelity, to detail, to logic, and to the unyielding conviction that no message, however delayed, is ever entirely beyond delivery. In the weeks that followed the conclusion of the Harcourt affair, at Baker Street resumed its accustomed rhythm, yet I perceived in Holmes a contemplative undercurrent that had not entirely subsided. Though new clients crossed our threshold and fresh enigmas demanded his formidable faculties, there remained upon his desk a single object connected with Deepdene House, a small sketch he had made of the terrace balustrade, its fractured mortar precisely rendered in pencil. One quiet evening, as the wind pressed insistently against the window panes and the fire burned low, I ventured to revisit the subject which had so long occupied us. "You are satisfied, then," I said, "that every element of the case has been accounted for?" Holmes, who had been idly turning the sketch between his fingers, regarded me with a faint arch of the brow.
Satisfaction, my dear Watson, is a rare commodity in our profession, but coherence, yes. The narrative now aligns without strain. And yet, I pressed gently, there was a time when it did not. He inclined his head. Indeed, when we first stood upon that terrace, we possessed motive and confession, but not precision. Adrian Harcourt's revised statement introduced ambiguity. Without resolving the mechanics of the fall, the law might have been persuaded that the blow and the death were separated by misfortune rather than causation. "The fracture in the mortar," I said. "Precisely. A trivial detail to the casual eye, yet decisive. The direction and nature of the break established the presence of two bodies in violent contact at the balustrade. Reginald did not fall in isolation.
That he was engaged in struggle at the very point of collapse. Holmes rose and moved toward the mantel where the violin lay waiting. He did not yet take it up, but stood with one hand resting lightly upon its case. "The case, when reduced to essentials," he continued, "was never one of mystery in the theatrical sense. It was one of interruption. A message sent to prevent disaster was intercepted. An inquiry that should have occurred at once was deferred for 20 years. Our task was not to uncover the unknown, but to restore the sequence." I reflected upon this. "And the key to restoration was the telegram itself." "Yes, and the conscience that preserved it." Holmes's voice softened almost imperceptibly. "Bellamy's hesitation was human. His eventual action was courageous. Without it, the distortion might have endured indefinitely." "And Adrian?" I asked. "Do you believe remorse accompanied his confession?" Holmes considered. "Remorse is seldom pure. In his case it was mingled with self-pity and fear. Yet when confronted with physical fact, when the stone itself contradicted his revision, he ceased to resist. That at least suggests some vestige of honesty." The wind subsided outside, leaving a brief, resonant stillness. "It strikes me," I said slowly, "that Reginald Harcourt displayed remarkable clarity in his final hour. To include, 'ask for the lark,' to anticipate interception, speaks of composure under threat." Holmes nodded. "A mind aware of danger, yet determined to act rationally. Had I arrived in time, the confrontation might have unfolded differently. But speculation is a barren field. We deal in what occurred." "And what occurred," I ventured, "was that anger, once unleashed, outpaced reason." "Just so. Violence is often the child of wounded pride. Adrian feared exposure more than he feared moral consequence. In seeking to silence scandal, he created tragedy." Holmes at last took up the violin and drew from it a single, sustained note, low and resonant. "Yet consider," he added, "how fragile the concealment proved. A dent in bronze, a fissure in mortar, a forgotten diary, such humble witnesses. Truth requires no flourish, it requires only endurance." I smiled. "You make it sound almost inevitable." "It is inevitable," he replied quietly, "provided there exists someone willing to observe without prejudice." He lowered the bow and turned toward me, his expression lit by that familiar glint of intellectual satisfaction. "The final lesson, Watson, is this. Delay alters consequence but not causation. The telegram's late arrival did not change the past, it illuminated it. Once illuminated, the pattern became unmistakable. And you, as ever, traced the pattern. Holmes allowed himself the faintest shrug. I merely followed where the details led. It is the details that deserve admiration. A knock sounded below, heralding yet another visitor. Holmes's features brightened with renewed animation, the contemplative mood dissolving into alert readiness. "Duty calls," he said lightly. "Shall we see what fresh absurdity London has devised?" As we descended the familiar stairs of Baker Street, I felt again that stirring anticipation which has so often accompanied the threshold of the unknown. Yet the memory of Deep Dean lingered, not as a spectre, but as a testament. For in that case, more than in many others, I had witnessed the quiet triumph of reason over distortion. A plea sent in desperation, buried by fear, had at last reached the mind capable of interpreting it. Though it could not avert the fatal blow, it ensured that the blow was neither forgotten nor misnamed, and thus the telegram that arrived 20 years late fulfilled its ultimate purpose. It summoned Sherlock Holmes not merely to solve a puzzle, but to restore balance where time and silence had conspired against it.